Despair. Two beasts could be seen running to the boundary of the central eastern forest, northern territory, seemingly trying to escape from something. At first glance, it looked like the snake in the front was being chased by the tiger at the back, but this notion was broken when the tiger started to overtake the snake and wasn't slowing down at all. These two haggard-looking beasts were actually running from something else. But what was it? That shameless cat, how dare he? Is what could be interpreted from Draco's thoughts. His mind was completely gripped by fear, and as a result his thinking abilities were severely diminished, so when he saw that Draco was surpassing him, unjustified rage started to occupy his thoughts. He was completely blaming his dilemma on the tiger and wanted nothing more than for Draco to be used as bait to aid in his escape. But how could that be possible? At this moment, Draco could feel an ominous presence in the air that was constantly looming over them, but he had zero interest in staying to find out its origin, so he left Draco in the dust without a second thought and focused all his efforts on escaping. Soon, he could finally see the boundary of this accursed territory and hope flooded his heart. At this point all distractful desires like ambition and vengeance were washed clean. He only hoped to escape without issue and live to see another day. But it seemed fate had something else in store for him. SSSHH. Just as Draco was about to reach the edge of the territory, a loud sound of rustling leaves was heard. Draco quickly stopped running and turned his head to the left, looking for the source of the sound. But nothing was there. Just as he was about to turn back, a sudden smell that caused his hairs to stand on end entered his nose. Draco slowly looked back to his front. Standing just in front of the edge of the territory was an enormous beast that surpassed 10 meters tall, standing on 4 legs. The behemoth-like creature had pristine white fur that gave off a holy glow, eyes that were completely pale blue with no other color that shone like stars, hooves carved from ice that released a cold mist, and 2 antlers in the same nature but replaced the mist with swirling blue lights. It was the guardian of the eastern forest, Dodo. Draco couldn't help being petrified by the colossal beast in front him that was brimming with a celestial's disposition. Looking at the menacing antlers that resembled tree branches because of the elk's ridiculous size, Draco couldn't but begin to shake violently. This was not an existence he could compete with at all. Draco shared the same sentiment, but he was not so foolish as to remain in place, shaking in fear like a certain pussycat. He turned around and fled immediately after recovering from shock. As someone who also contained a law in his body, Dodo's presence wasn't so brain-crippling to him even if the elk had 3 laws. Unlike the so-called Beast King, Draco still retained some ability to act upon his thoughts, something the tiger was unable to do no matter how much he screamed at himself to run. So Draco didn't hesitate to run. He wanted nothing more than to escape this calamitous beast and never meet it again. Just look at those antlers. They radiated a shocking amount of energy that Draco was unable to identify, but he could feel the terrifying coldness all the way here, a strange feeling that he only felt once before because of his fire laws. And the first time he ever felt cold was naturally when he met Dodo for the first time. That was a devastating experience for the Snake Clan that they would never forget. Half of them died after all. But unfortunately for Draco, even if he didn't want to experience the might of the guardian of the forest, he wasn't the one making decisions here. Dodo softly tapped his hoof. CCCCCCCCRRR. Ice began to explosively spread out from the point Dodo's hoof made contact with the ground, quickly reaching both Draco and freezing them up to their necks, leaving their heads free. Clack, clack, clack. Dodo began to slowly walk up to the 2 beasts, causing them shiver even more than what the frigid ice was doing to them. At this point it looked like they were vibrating. Well, their bodies from the neck down were frozen completely, but their heads. One couldn't help but wonder if their heads were going to snap off. As Dodo got closer to Draco, he manipulated the ice to bring Draco right beside his former enemy, lining them up like 2 naughty school kids in front of the teacher's desk. Their rapidly shaking heads made the scene more comical than it was. But for Draco and Draco, this situation was more like, neither of them could think coherently anymore, their minds on the verge of collapsing. Dodo's indomitable and world-threatening aura, the blood-freezing cold, the futility to resist, the inability to comprehend, and the presumption of certain death. It was utter despair. Gradually, Draco and Draco's eyes began to rise up with froth beginning to leak out of their mouths. Dodo stiffened. He didn't mean for things to go this far. He had only meant to scare them a little bit, but he didn't know the effect his killing intent had on people. Most of the time, he killed his enemies before they could even feel anything, talk less of despair on this level, either that or they ran away. He never held them captive like he was doing now, and the results were as shown. Dodo sighed in lament. He had only wanted to have a conversation as fellow rulers of this forest. They made his job of protecting the forest and more importantly Sira easier after all. But he couldn't just let them go unpunished, could he? Otherwise they would take him for a joke and come to mess around in his territory again. But look at the result. Dodo sighed one more time before a sudden ice storm formed around him, quickly hiding him from view. However, it didn't last long and it soon disappeared, but when it did, Dodo was nowhere to be seen. The ice that he had left in this place also shattered, leaving the two remaining beasts to slump down, finally free. But the damage had been done. All that could be seen of their eyes was white sclera and burst blood cells as they continuously twitched. 12 comments, 0 vote. Brotherhood formed from adversity. A whole month had passed before the two beasts did something other than twitching with their eyes rolled up and saliva dribbling freely. Cock. Reiko was the first to snap awake and choke on the saliva and unsuspecting inhabitants that was no doubt filling his throat. He began to shiver as he briefly reminisced the never-ending nightmare that he had to undergo this entire time. Fortunately, he managed to break out when he had finally built up resistance, an unforeseen benefit that would aid him in future. KOOOHKTUH. Draco suddenly spat out a glob of spit containing a few bugs onto the floor, indicating his revival but creating a nauseating sight. But Draco was in no shape or form to care about such trivial things. He looked around wildly, like a cornered beast looking for its predator. To see such a mighty figure like Draco now act like a helpless prey was just too regrettable. If anyone from the Snake clan was to see him now, his reputation would vanish like smoke. Fortunately, Draco soon calmed down when he saw there was no one else here apart from Reiko, who was currently getting up and preparing to leave. Hiss. Draco hissed at him to grab his attention, successfully making the tiger turn around in slight shock and more confusion. To be honest, Reiko had completely forgotten that Draco was here. He had more pressing things in mind, like the condition of his mind and body. Moreover, he had been away for an undetermined amount of time, so he needed to check in his territory as soon as possible. Does he seriously still want to fight? Reiko thought warily. He was honestly tired of fighting right now and didn't want to go head-to-head with the snake, knowing things could get out of hand. But against Reiko's expectations, Draco dipped his head, briefly flashing the suspiciously familiar antlers attached to his forehead before raising his head and looking into Reiko's eyes intently. This action was a complete shock to the tiger because the meaning of this gesture wasn't light at all. Since there were many beasts with different types of vocal abilities, there was no way to achieve conversation yet. So the two leading beasts at the time, Dodo and Jorma, came up with a set of gestures as a temporary substitute. Monarch's note. Spirit beasts can communicate mentally. Closing curly bracket. There were two common gestures that everyone used. One was to completely lay on your belly with your head touching the ground, indicating surrender or submission. The other was to slowly nod your head to the other whilst maintaining eye contact. This action meant that you considered the other an equal and that you respected them. More importantly, it meant that you were seeking friendship with the other. If the other was to reciprocate the gesture, it meant that they were accepting the offer of friendship. Reiko was completely stunned. Was this still the same evil snake that chased him all the time? At first he was angry. How dare he still seek friendship with him after all they had done? Was his desire for revenge something that could be disregarded so easily just because the other finally acknowledged him? Complex thoughts like that flipped through his brain, agitating him further and further until he almost began growling. Any other beast wouldn't be so pressured. It would be a yes, let's be friends, or no, how dare you, let's fight. Magic beasts had both a low IQ and EQ after all. But Reiko wasn't stupid in the slightest. He was someone who had entered the second stage of anatomy refinement, which had granted him greater cognitive abilities. So he was able to assess how he felt about things and what was the smarter decision to make. Just as Reiko was deciding to walk away, ignoring the snake and letting their feud continue, he thought about all the things he had experienced. Anatomy refinement, conquering territory and becoming a beast king, all of these things happened because of the snake that had entered his life. If it wasn't for that harrowing event, he would still be a nobody. Which, to be honest, wasn't all that bad, because even if he was a nobody, he had no ambition and his life was never in jeopardy as a great tiger. This thought made him feel like turning away from the snake again. But the key word ambition suddenly grabbed his attention. Of course, it wasn't actually that word, but it is what could be interpreted from his thoughts. He realized that ever since he began subjugating other species, this is the emotion that had occupied his thoughts. Thoughts of revenge. They would only come back whenever he encountered the snake and a fight was immediately started. Reiko was beginning to realize the immense lack of care he had for this so-called revenge. He never had time to think of such things, and he always had fun every day when he increased his strength along with those in his territory. Reiko sighed. To think that an intelligent beast like him was being ridden by reflex ghost emotions, such a disgrace. It was this thought that enabled him to think of the other things both he and Draco had gone through, especially with the recent bout with the Guardian of the Forest. Thinking about how both he and Draco, two apex predators being put into such a critical condition because of the mere presence of a herbivore of all things, Reiko felt a slight sense of companionship, the kind you feel when you and another overcome something dangerous together, especially with the situation as crazy as it was now. Reiko sighed one more time before reciprocating Draco's gesture and accepting his offer of friendship. Draco paused for a moment, seemingly stunned before turning around and slithering away. Looking at the view of his back, Reiko felt that the snake seemed to have become more mature, making him chuckle. He too turned away, walking back to his territory with a slow gait. 9 comments 0 vote. The Dragon Clan. Over on the other side of the central continent, the dragons had achieved complete domination over the western forest. Not only had they subordinated a few of the powerful beast clans, but they had taken it a step further to enslave or kill the rest. It was extremely brutal, but it couldn't be helped. Dragons were innately arrogant and they were very dominating. This led to them being very territorial. Add on the fact that no one else could contest with them, then you get a group of apathetically ruthless individuals. Fortunately, the humans in this forest had been taken as subordinates because of their great control over their bodies and, minor, ability to create things. Although the dragons had conquered the entire forest, they were mainly seen flying around a shockingly huge mountain that had managed to actually bypass the clouds like it was nothing. On this mountain there were 15 peaks with a built-in cave and ledge on each one, as if they were designed for some kind of flying beast to inhabit them. This was obviously not a naturally formed mountain. In fact, there was no such thing left after the world was almost destroyed prior to Eridel's appearance. This was something Eridel made when he knew he was going to be housing dragons. Eridel wasn't exactly sure, but he guessed that dragons loved high places, so he decided to give them this minor gift. And he wasn't wrong in doing so. Unsurprisingly, the dragons had been rallied under their very own beast king, or to be more specific, the Dragon King. It was the largest alpha dragon who had been bestowed with the razor-sharp spike at the tip of its tail as soon as it had evolved in the magical outburst. And it was this dragon who was housed in the cave at the highest peak. But what was surprising was the aura of metal that this particular dragon radiated as he sat upon his proud peak. It was extremely rare for anything to have affinity with the metal element, since there were barely any metals in the entire world, so how could someone gain enlightenment? There should be no one with metal affinity for thousands of years unless Eridel chose to speed up the process. But here was one lucky dragon who had managed to make a fortunate encounter. The truth was that when this dragon was proudly exploring his cave, he had encountered a bunch of glowing purple rocks that were emitting a lot of essence. Thinking that they would make him stronger just like magic herbs, he decided to eat them. To no avail, of course. Beasts were only capable of absorbing essence from flesh and herbs. In fact, that was the only way they could become stronger. There were very few cultivation techniques that beasts could use, and more often than not, they weren't that great anyway. Nevertheless, you would rarely see such things outside of a law world. As compensation, beasts had an outstanding efficiency in absorbing the essence from flesh and herbs. Only someone with Jorma with her earth-devouring bloodline could absorb a percentage of essence from whatever she ate. This ability only grew stronger as her bloodline evolved, but that's besides the point. Enlightened species and others could absorb energy from the air through techniques, but their ability to absorb the essence from flesh and herbs was just too low. Fortunately, they could make pills with alchemy, saving a lot of essence from a herb, but there was nothing they could do about the meat. The only reason the blood fiends had such a shockingly high efficiency in absorbing blood was because the amount of essence in blood was incomparable to what was in the flesh. So although it was still unfairly high, it wasn't so balance-breaking. But if they ever encountered a species that contained their essence in their blood. As for the monster species, they grew stronger by kiloing. Of course, Eridel could have changed things, but he was fine with how they were. He liked how all the different factions had different ways of cultivation. What, you want to know about the monsters? He, more on that later. Back on the Dragon King, he decided to eat these so-called stones that were actually magic crystals, intending to absorb the essence inside of them. But these were crystals that had evolved when the magical outburst had occurred. Not only were they products of the world, meaning anything under Realm 4 was incapable of damaging them, they were also magic metals, making them even harder. As a result, the almighty Dragon King lost a good amount of teeth. After howling in pain for a few minutes, the Dragon King finally calmed down. But instead of being resentful, the king was actually ecstatic. He could sense that other than magic energy, there was some other kind of essence. And it was of course the metal essence. His brethren had already decided to comprehend other elements like water, wood and air, but most commonly fire. How could they comprehend fire, you say? Well, the dragons had discovered a mysterious never-ending violet-colored flame in the Dragon Mountain's biggest cave. The flame was extremely hot and not something they could come close to without suffering severe consequences. But more on the truth of this flame later. The Dragon King was also one of those that studied these flames and eventually gained the qualifications to absorb the smallest of residues from the flame, gaining a fire affinity just like the others who had done the same thing. But unlike others, he felt that he could comprehend another element. This was not something that was normally possible. When you gained an elemental affinity, the truths of other elements were forever barred until you gained the mental capacity. Only the genius amongst the geniuses could gain another affinity whenever they wanted. Keep in mind that being born with two elemental affinities wasn't the same as being born with one and comprehending another. The latter was just too rare and way too hard to accomplish. Yet here we were, discussing another of this Dragon King's ridiculous talents. The Dragon King could have chosen something else to study like water or earth, but his pride prevented him from doing so. Such things were so common and their capabilities were so low, so how could he content himself with that? Discovering this hidden metal element was like a godsend to him, and he refused to waste this opportunity. So a situation where a dragon held a glowing crystal in his hand and stared at it as if it contained the truths of the world occurred for 5 years. 17 comments, 0 vote. Download the app for greater interaction. You can chat with me about my writing experience apart from the comments section. SolitaryMonarch. Download app now. The Crystal Dragon King. 5 years passed before the Dragon King had successfully comprehended the metal affinity. Now all he had to do was absorb the metal essence from the crystals, something he could now do. Whether it was metals, flames or water etc., it was impossible to absorb their respective elemental essences without having the corresponding comprehension or affinity. If you only had the comprehension, you gained the affinity; if you had the affinity, you gained more power. It was that simple. And now, the Dragon King was gifted with the opportunity to gain a second affinity. Naturally he accepted it with open arms, absorbing the metal essence with no hesitation. As for the magical energy inside the crystals, it was impossible to obtain without special methods. After that, a few years passed where the Dragon King sparred with his fellow brethren and tempered his killing intent using the lives of other species, mostly the slaves. It was cruel, but such was the law of the beasts. Eventually, the Dragon King broke through and became a stage 1 spirit beast. But when he did so, grand changes took place. The goal of the spirit beast stage was to enhance your soul or to the best of your ability. Most living things had souls, but the souls of beasts before the spirit beast stage were just so useless that you might as well ignore it completely. Their souls were just so incapable of capability that thoughts eluded them and their instincts controlled their every action. Of course, there were special cases and talented races, but the majority of beasts were like this. But everything changed when you became a spirit beast. You gained the same soul power that the enlightened had, gaining the average enlightened species intelligence at stage 9. You gained the spirit sensibility and you gained the ability to converse telepathically. These were all great boons that the enlightened species were denied when they entered Realm 2 mana refinement. More importantly, in every realm breakthrough that a beast went through, they gained the chance to evolve. If they were talented enough, they had the ability to encode their comprehensions and affinities that they gained throughout their lives into their very DNA. This not only made their skills as smooth as breathing, it made those skills stronger and more engineered for them. For example, for a dragon that became a fire dragon, his flames were no longer just flames. They were now dragon flames. But most importantly, their offspring would be born with their abilities, with the more powerful ones being locked until they had the power to use them. As it stands, races like the dragons would always evolve each realm breakthrough. They were just that talented. It is what it is. And that is exactly what the Dragon King was going through. Black scales were shed as the Dragon King roared in agony. His teeth and claws shattered like glass, and his horns along with his tail spike were reduced to powder. His eyes bled and gallons of blood leaked out of his mouth. Clearly, something had gone wrong with his organs. When the reverse scale was suddenly but ruthlessly torn from the Dragon King, his roaring stopped and his shaking stilled. He seemed to have calmed down. But if you looked closer, the king seemed a little strange. He was crazily twitching like a fish out of water, and his eyes were extremely unfocused, rapidly looking in every direction like a deranged mental patient. Just as it seemed that it couldn't get any worse, disgusting amounts of impurities started to slowly seep out of his pores, indicating that he was undergoing anatomy refinement. It looked quite painful. And indeed it was. The reverse scale of a dragon was simultaneously their toughness, defense, and biggest weak point. Whenever this defense was breached, it would cause unholy amounts of pain. But soon, things began to look up for the Dragon King. I mean, could it still be called an evolution if all it did was bully you? The Dragon King began to grow and suddenly roared with rage as he looked up at the skies. What, did he want to burn the heavens, or go against fate if fate goes against him? Maybe he was thinking of breaking through the firmament and covering the world with his wings. Who knew what this lizard was thinking? But soon, as the Dragon King continued to roar, the most beautiful of scales began to develop all over his body. They were an alluring magenta color that tantalized the eyes, their faint transparency akin to that of crystals and their twinkling lights reminiscent of the stars. It was like his scales had been forged from the magic crystals that he had been studying for the past 5 years. His claws, horns and tail spike regrew, and they were also crystal-like, but these a deep violet color with a strangely enchanting but menacing light that periodically pulsed like a beating heart. The pressure they emitted was as if it was threatening to cause laceration just by looking at it. Naturally, his teeth were not left out. Thankfully they weren't also purple but the regular white, but the reflective luster they had were not normal at all. Each and every tooth was like that of a blade's edge. Looking at all these features, one would almost think that his eyes would take on the same appearance, but they did not. His eyes were fairly normal, a white sclera and whatnot, but that's where the normality of it ended. His iris was actually a ridiculous purple that seemed to be made from blazing flames, and the fact that there were no pupils made them look like two purple suns, making anyone that looked into them feel intimidated. Ruah-arr-arr-arr-arr-arr. Orange flames erupted around the Dragon King's body, burning all the impurities as he simultaneously roared with flames erupting from his mouth. There was obvious excitement and pride on his face, filled with glee at his accomplishments, and you couldn't blame him. Looking at the crystal-like scales that covered the dragon from head to toe, one couldn't help but be awed. It seems that his 5-year seclusion was not in vain. He did not comprehend the metal element per se, but the more elusive crystal element. This was a branch element of metal that was extremely hard to understand and something that was rare to see even in law worlds. It was much rarer than comprehending the element of ice, which was the branch element of water, so the fact that this Dragon King could obtain it was the best indicator of his seemingly rising talent. As for why he had obviously entered the anatomy refinement, this wasn't actually unexpected. In fact, if he didn't enter anatomy refinement, that meant that something had definitely gone wrong. Most races that had something like the earth element or the metal element would undergo anatomy refinement when they evolved for the first time. This was because the severe damage that they suffered and sometimes recovered from when reforging their bodies with that element as a base was just too savage. Especially those of the scaled races like dragons. Their entire scales were shredded, including their reverse scale, just so that they could become earth or metal etc. scales. They would naturally benefit from surviving such an ordeal. Ruah-aarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrarrar RR. A sudden pandemonium of noises erupted as each dragon rose into the air, flying around their king as they roared their zealous praises and congratulations. Hail, hail, all hail the king. 15 comments 0 vote. What an honorable brother. In the central continent, nothing else worth mentioning happened within the first 30 years of Eridel's seclusion. However, the world was much bigger than just the central continent. Over in the western continent, Chad, the only phoenix and most powerful being in the continent, should have had the easiest time out of all the powerhouses in this world. He had power, status and women. What more could a beast want? His future was bright and unbarricaded, so there should have been no problems. But unfortunately, that couldn't be further from the truth. While he was powerful and had all he could want, he wasn't prepared at all for things to go so wrong. Unlike the other powerhouses, Chad had decided to have children fairly quickly. The thing about having children as a beast is that you would always be weakened as a result of it. Most of the time it was negligible, but the stronger your race, the more weakened you would be when trying to create more of this race. This is the reason why the other beast powerhouses had refrained from bearing children, waiting on the time for everything to be perfectly safe. But Chad is the most powerful person in his vicinity, so how could he have such misgivings? Plus, he had already had children before, but they were killed in the magical outburst, something that always weighed heavily on his mind, so he decided that he was ready to repopulate his clan once more. Unfortunately, Chad had failed to detect the threat that had been waiting patiently right under his nose. Chad had many subordinates, including humans, but there were 3 people that would always be closest to him. His 2 wives and his last surviving brother, whom we will call Honorable Brother, for now. It's how Chad had been addressing him, not knowing the concept of names. All 3 of them were strange animals that looked like 2 meters tall dodo birds, the next evolution after chicken. They were also lucky enough to have obtained the ice affinity, a result of a special treasure that Chad had provided them with after his adventure across the continent. They had already had water affinity thanks to being in the spring of life when they evolved, so upgrading that affinity to the ice affinity wasn't too hard for first-generation beasts like them, no matter how untalented their race was. Obviously, for Chad, who was a fire-aligned beast, there was no longer any compatibility between him and his wives. But despite this, he still decided to impregnate them. With his life energy and the fact that they were previously the same species, it was enough to smooth over the edges. Plus, he was the one that would be providing all the energy for the eggs, saving his wives from being drained just to support his children. Unfortunately, this meant that he would be the one weakened, providing the perfect chance that good old Honorable Brother had been waiting for all this time. A few days after Chad had gone into seclusion to recover his mana, Honorable Brother finally struck. With his stage 9 magic beast strength, he easily invaded the cave where the 2 wives had laid an egg each, ruthlessly killing the stationed guards on his way. When he entered and saw the 2 wives, he looked at them with an obvious lascivious desire in his eyes, but quickly focused his attention on his true goal. The eggs of a phoenix. But more accurately, the essence and bloodline within. Yes. This Honorable Brother was actually coveting the bloodline of a phoenix in hopes that when he evolved at the spirit beast stage, he would overcome his limits and become a phoenix himself. This was the true reason why he had stopped cultivating when he became a peak stage 9 magic beast. With haste, he quickly kicked the 2 wives out of the way and grabbed the 2 eggs under his wings. Without hesitating, he quickly fled, knowing that he didn't have much time to glorify his easy success just yet. All the beasts started to squawk, roar or howl, when they heard the grievous news from 2 royal wives, enraged by the betrayal of their second-in-command. The stronger ones all began to rush out, intent on saving the king's children, but at this point the Honorable Brother had fled quite far. He was a stage 9 beast on the cusp of becoming a spirit beast after all. How could they catch him? Soon, he wasn't even in sight, and eventually, they lost him completely. A few hours later, Chad had finally been informed. A heavenly phoenix cry filled with righteous wrath filled the air, scaring every living being that heard and even causing the weaker beings to bleed through their ears and faint. Alas, Chad could barely even move right now. For a female beast to provide the energy to rear a powerful baby, it's extremely exhausting and they would definitely be bedridden, and for a father to provide that energy it was even worse. So imagine the situation Chad would be in when he did it twice in one go. 1 week later. At this moment, the Honorable Brother was attempting to use the technique that Eridel had left as an inheritance for every beast. The evolutionary blood beast technique. This was a power technique that Eridel had inherited from the Golden Orb, whose name and origin he still didn't know. It was supposed to be used on the off chance that when he finally collided with a core, it was a beast core, he would have the best technique to overcome his racial limits. This technique allowed one to use the blood of another beast to evolve, either taking aspects of that beast or becoming that beast and taking aspects of your previous race if your previous race was that trash in comparison. Of course, the technique that Eridel had passed on to the beasts of his world was heavily revised and had many limitations. 1. The technique could only be used once in your entire life. 2. You could only use the bloodline of a beast similar to yourself. For example, a bird should not use a wolf bloodline. If you ignored this, death is your only future. 3. There had to be at least 70% compatibility. If not, death is your only future. 4. The technique could only be used when you were evolving into a spirit beast. If you used it before then, death is your only future. 5. Using the technique would take your entire cultivation base as compensation. There were other limitations, but those 5 were the ones that prevented the beasts from being hasty the most. With countless beasts dying every day from failure to meet the requirements, the more intelligent beasts were hesitant to try. And it was this technique that our great, honorable, brother was currently using. 17 comments 0 vote. Ice Phoenix. The honorable brother was currently hiding in a secret location that he had found many years ago. Since then, he had always been planning for this very moment. With mixed excitement and fear, he gathered the 3 materials he needed to complete the procedure and maximize his success. 2 phoenix eggs and a 20-year-old magic icicle. The 20-year-old magic icicle is a natural treasure, an icicle that had managed to survive a year without melting, henceforth obtaining the foundation to cultivate by absorbing magical energy and the ice essence in the area. The longer a magical icicle has lived for, the more essence it has managed to absorb, granting ice affinity cultivators and water affinity cultivators hoping to gain comprehension massive benefits if they were to obtain it. Of course, like with all things, there were mutative cases here and there. In rare situations, the magic icicle absorbed more than just magical energy and ice essence, causing a change in the icicle, but that's for another time. The magic icicle in the honorable brother's possession was a gift from Chad in his journey up north. The Phoenix had managed to find a few of such things and guessed they would be of benefit to his wives and brother when he identified the similarity in essences between the icicle and Dodo, the guardian of the forest, someone he had never forgotten. So he took them back to his brethren, extremely pleased with the subsequent results. He was glad that his few remaining clan members would be able to prosper with him. As a matter of fact, he focused most of his resources on his honorable brother because even though he could have chosen someone else with more talent, he wanted this brother of his that had been with him for such a long time to be his powerful right-hand man. But this is the result of his faithful dedication. A traitorous bird that was currently cracking open the eggs of his children and swallowing the contents. When the honorable brother had swallowed both eggs, he quickly huddled closer to the magic icicle before initiating his breakthrough to spirit beast realm and activating the evolutionary blood beast technique at the same time. Whum. A terrifying pressure was released from the honorable brother's body that sent the rocks and random debris around him flying against the walls of the cave that he was currently hiding in. The honorable brother squawked in pain as the hot phoenix bloodline ferociously infiltrated his veins, causing harrowing amounts of damage all over his body. This was a result of the titanic difference in bloodline levels, causing a situation where the phoenix bloodline was domineeringly erasing the inferior bloodline. On top of that, even if Chad was still a magic beast and as a result had not imprinted his fire and life laws into his DNA, he was still a fire elemental beast when he evolved in the magical outburst. This went against the nature of the honorable brother who had the ice affinity. With all these things against the honorable brother's favor, this normally would have resulted in his death. But 4 things were currently helping him. First was the magical energy being absorbed into him as a result of his breakthrough to the spirit beast stage. This along with the magical energy in his beast core was being used to nurture his body, preventing it from breaking down. But that alone was not nearly enough. Second was the fact that he was also evolving and becoming an ice elemental beast. This along with the fact that he was desperately absorbing the ice essence from the 20-year-old magic icicle, helped him to offset the excessive heat from the bloodline. Third, the bloodline of the phoenix contained the life element, inadvertently healing him as he absorbed it, creating a cycle of destruction and restoration. And fourth was that both Chad and the honorable brother were both originally chicken, previously having the same bloodline and henceforth having some compatibility. This was actually the most important point. Without this minuscule bloodline connection, the result would have been complete failure. As an extension of the fourth reason, the phoenix bloodline he was absorbing was from a child between Chad and his two wives who were the exact same race as him, increasing the compatibility drastically. Now don't get things twisted, the phoenix bloodline was completely 100% phoenix. This was a result of how powerful the bloodline was, causing it to use the other bloodline as fuel instead of mixing. But nevertheless, the egg was nurtured in those wives, so there was still compatibility. All of these things contributed to saving his life and securing his success. Without pause, the honorable brother began to change. His height didn't grow, but his wings became larger and larger as his skeletal-muscular system began to rearrange itself. His head and beak shape changed, becoming smaller but more angular, projecting a beautiful and noble visage. His feet also changed, becoming bigger with the individual claws becoming more spaced out, giving it more room for any kind of use. Each claw was also very curved and extremely sharp, making them an entire weapon on its own. Honorable brother flapped his wings twice in excitement as the feathers on his body began to glow brightly as shockingly light blue flames danced around them. This was a frightening phenomenon that showcased the honorable brother's new capabilities. The evolution had actually forced the equilibrium between the ice and fire essences to undergo a terrifying fusion, causing the two opposing elements to fuse and create something new, frost flames. The honorable brother didn't know this, but the scythe of death had just skimmed over his head. Without the fact that the honorable brother also obtained the life elemental essence from the bloodline whilst also gaining life affinity, that nurtured the process, even though the evolutionary blood beast technique worked and he would have managed to live, he would have become an abomination. Unless he had a technique to fuse the two essences, it would cause the evolution to fail, and he would become an abomination. Though it would have belonged to the extremely powerful kind with the fire and ice essence fighting against each other, refining themselves as the life essence restored the damage. Come to think of it, this would have been an extremely dangerous abomination, but fortunately for the residents of the world, the opportunity was missed. The previously mentioned compatibility had caused ice and fire essences to be very slightly hesitant to harm each other, since they were tied to the two bloodlines at the time. This hesitation gave the life element enough time to mediate the differences between the two and narrowly escape a terrifying result. Soon, the process was complete. All the magical energy in the honorable brother's body had vanished, but he had accomplished his goal. He had become a phoenix, but not only that, he had become something different to his brother, an ice phoenix. If Eridel was watching, he would have been mentally clapping his hands with excitement whilst contemplating throwing a divine tribulation at the so-called honorable brother. He really hated betrayal, but it is what it is. On a side note, the only reason this honorable brother was still 2 meters tall was because he had lost all of his cultivation, becoming a regular animal that wasn't even a stage 1 magic beast. He should be glad he didn't become smaller instead. And yet, in spite of all his gains, a greedy and cunning expression etched itself on the phoenix's face as the image of 2 dodo-looking birds entered his mind. He wasn't done quite yet. Oh dear brother, how are you doing now? Are you taking good care of yourself? Oh, please be well when I see you again. A look of disdain flashed on the phoenix's face as he flapped his wings and flew out of the cave with shocking speed. As he rose into the air, he gave out an ear-piercing phoenix cry, not unlike that of his brother. Haha, I always wanted to do that. 33 comments 0 vote. Unknown creatures. Whilst the Western continent experienced turbulent changes, the high humans in the Eastern continent continued to prosper under the rule of their queen. Despite the queen's lack of knowledge, she was just way too smart. She had been able to steer her fellow high humans onto the path of supremacy fairly quickly, and not only that, their ability to create wasn't lacking in the least. Not only had they managed to build primitive homes made out of wood and thatch, but they had even learned how to make a few pieces of furniture, for example a bed made from the hides of various beasts. Normally it was very hard to harvest the materials of nature such as wood. You would only be able to grab things like broken off twigs and sometimes branches, and that was if you were lucky. But the queen was smart enough to realize that she could use these rarely found branches and such as tools to obtain more materials. The high humans would crudely slam their branches onto harder objects like stones with the purpose of getting it to snap. When they accomplished this, a sharp edge was created and many possibilities were now open. This is how they dug holes all those years ago, but now they used them for many different purposes. In fact, one of the activities they used them for was fighting. Indeed, they used broken wood branches as weapons. Now, this couldn't be compared to the blood fiends who were using the much more dangerous stalactites, but that was something they had found due to luck. Unlike the high humans who were swiftly developing the idea of crafting. Soon they would make better tools than broken branches. In fact, it was these broken branches that allowed them to subjugate various beast clans and rapidly expand their territory that consisted of half the southern region of the eastern continent. But it wasn't only their tools that made up their strength. Because of their great intelligence, not only did they discover how to use tactics in battle, but they had something that most of the world was missing: martial arts. They weren't like the barbarians who only know how to clobber with their fists, nor were they like the blood fiends that would only know how to stab with their stalactites. The high humans had actually discovered how to make specific maneuvers with their weapon to inflict the most damage. And naturally, the queen was the greatest in this regard. For her, calculating the distance, angle and velocity in order to create the most perfect strike at the most opportune time was as easy as blinking. The queen was a terrifying and unrivaled existence that would definitely take a main seat at the summit of the world. On that note, the queen had managed to break through to the third stage of the mana refinement realm, almost catching up to the queen of the elves, Titania. This was a result of her very own personalized cultivation technique that she was currently developing and improving every day. For now she called it Path of the Sun, even though it had nothing to do with the sun. But it was indeed suitable for people with light elemental mana formed from light essence instead of magical energy. She was also able to revise the cultivation technique that all enlightened beings were given and create an improved version that was more compatible with the high human race that even children could use. This caused their average cultivation to be at level stage 5 of body refinement stage, with the most talented being at stage 8. Speaking of children, the high human offspring were so talented and smart that they were able to begin cultivating at the average age of 4. 5 being the latest and 3 the quickest. On a side note, the queen was currently creating a language after gaining inspiration from the monkeys. The way they made different kinds of sounds consisting of screeches and howls as they looked at each other before performing certain actions made her think they were communicating somehow, something that embarrassed her greatly when she thought of her own race's inability to converse. But that naturally didn't last long. She was soon able to form words that had specific meanings, plus, they sounded much nicer than the crude sounds that the beasts made. The queen is indeed intelligent. Southern continent, central forest. In an unknown location of the forest was a pond surrounded by verdure. A black-scaled rhino entered the scene through a bush, seemingly intent on taking a drink. It was a powerful stage 6 magic beast. The rhino calmly ducked its head and lapped up the water in big gulps. Beautiful trees and bushes, a bright sun and a clear spring. It created a wonderful scene of nature. But that was only how it looked. Anyone actually here would be able to notice the tension that was so thick that it was almost tangible. Something was seriously wrong with this place. For starters, it was completely quiet. No chirps of birds, no sounds of insects, no sounds of squirrels running through trees and bushes. It was completely silent save for the sound of the rhino drinking water. Second was the faintly noticeable blood stains that could be seen here and there. In fact, in every direction you looked, you would be able to see blood stains if you focused. Even more suspicious was the random piles of ash. But it was so fine-grained and dust-like. What could burn to this extent? Something was clearly RSHSHSHSHSHSH. The sound of rustling leaves suddenly broke out, destroying the fragile image of peace. The rhino was no longer alone, and there were now 5 strange creatures surrounding it. They looked like tiny yet humanoid beings with green skin and large wrinkly heads. They had black beady eyes, jagged teeth and sharp claws. Out of the 5, 4 of them were at the 4th stage of the first realm, with the last one being at the 5th stage. He was also the tallest, standing at 80 centimeters tall. Clearly, he was the leader. The rhino snapped up its head in fear, but when it saw their low cultivation levels, it snorted in anger. A group of trash dared to confront it. But although the rhino was full of rage, it didn't make a peep. It knew better than to make a commotion and draw unwanted attention to itself in this god-forsaken forest. As the rhino contemplated on which insect to attack first, the 5 creatures suddenly sprang at him. Clearly, they weren't afraid to make the first move. 18 comments 0 vote. The horrifying southern continent. These hideous creatures had a spine-chilling red aura around them that was filled with killing intent. If there was someone from another world here to see this scene, they would be shocked. Since when was killing intent visible? The rhino was startled at first but snorted once more in disdain. He was a stage 6 magic beast with defense as his primary ability. Could these little rats even harm him? The rhino lowered his head so that his horn was poised to deal fatal damage and charged at the closest opponent. Unfortunately, the rhino was too heavy and slow whilst the strange creature was extremely nimble. He easily dodged to the side before jumping towards the rhino's flank with outstretched claws. Swip! Shockingly enough, the strike was able to breach the tough defense of the rhino's tough scales, inflicting sharp pain on the beast. But strangely enough the rhino only grimaced. He was still unwilling to make any sounds that could draw attention to himself, so he suppressed his desire to roar. Moreover, he was secretly terrified. How could such weak creatures harm him? Should he run? But before he could make a decision, all 5 creatures leapt to him at once with perfect synergy, and it was at this moment the rhino knew that he was done for, but he will make them pay a severe price. And so a silent battle of life and death continued like this. Claws flashing and jagged teeth snapping, a fatal horn puncturing and massive feet stomping. Soon the rhino was on its last legs and covered in blood as it heaved heavily. On the other side there were only 2 of those strange creatures remaining. The leader and one of its henchmen. Those 2 were also covered in bruises from the times they got rammed into, but there was no blood on them, unlike their 3 fallen brethren that now looked like mashed up meat. Despite this, they sported hideous grins as they looked at their prey that seemed like it was going to collapse at any moment. As they limped forward, EUUUURRRRGH. The rhino suddenly let out a thunderous roar that resounded throughout the forest and used the last of his strength to charge at the creature closest to him, which happened to be the leader. Obviously he had no more qualms about arousing attention to himself anymore. In fact, the thought of what would happen filled him with savage glee. The leader of the 2 remaining creatures was flabbergasted by the turn of events. He hadn't expected the beast to still possess so much energy, causing him to be unable to react. Clearly, the rhino had been pretending. On top of that, the roar had a slight stunning effect which almost cost him his life. Luckily, he was able to break out of the effect and safely dive to the side. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about his last remaining follower. Although his follower leapt to the other side, he was too slow and as a result his shoulder was pierced. A green arm was sent flying into the air. The creature was shocked. Whose arm was that? Was it the leader's? But a sudden devastating pain assaulted his senses, causing him to look at the origin of the pain. But what he saw nearly shocked him to death. Ayah! The creature screamed in agony as it looked at its remaining stump that began to bleed profusely with terrified eyes. He was finished, he knew it. Actually, he would be able to survive that kind of injury. Beings of its kind wouldn't die from something like that. But it was not the injury that concerned him. His eyes filled with terror quickly looked towards his leader. At this point, the rhino had finally collapsed dead. It had used the rest of its energy and no longer had the ability to preserve its life. Today, a mighty stage 6 magic beast that could be amongst the upper elite in any other part of the world had fallen prey to the law of the jungle like a common beast. What's worse is that it was defeated by strange creatures that only had one being at stage 5. What a grand humiliation. But the leader of these creatures didn't care in the slightest. Although a look of extreme glee covered its face, it knew it didn't have much time. That last roar of the rhino had definitely revealed their location and he needed to escape. But it stubbornly waited for something. What could it? SSSSSSSSs. The rhino started to deflate like a balloon. 10 seconds later, it had turned into a big pile of ash that wasn't any different to the other random piles of ash, only, this pile was quite large. Now, it was obvious how they came to be. A hair-raising red-colored mass of essence suddenly coalesced itself above the pile of ash before splitting into 2 portions, the much bigger portion flying to the leader whilst the other flew towards the scrub. The strange essence was filled with all sorts of resentment, grievance, vengeance and other negative emotions including killing intent. If this was absorbed by anyone, there was a very high chance of it affecting their psyche. But the leader wasn't worried at all. It watched his portion come with obvious excitement, and the reason became obvious when the strange energy fused with his body. Like clockwork, his own peculiar aura from before burst out of him once more, but this time it was much bigger and denser. He had broken through. The leader had now entered stage 6 and likewise, the same process repeated itself in the other creature and it entered stage 5 even though the portion it obtained was much smaller. But for some reason, there was no happiness on its face at all, unlike the leader that was cackling loudly. It only looked wary. When it saw its leader snap its attention toward him, it didn't hesitate to run away. Unfortunately, the leader was much stronger and caught up in no time. With an evil grin on its face, it plunged its hand through its comrade's back, with a heart appearing in its hand when it went through the other side. There was no guilt or remorse on its face, only deranged exhilaration. The same thing that happened to the rhino repeated itself with the creature, and it was soon reduced to ash. The resulting killing essence that was released was quickly absorbed by the leader, making its own aura rise again, but clearly it wasn't enough for it to break through. Drunk on its rising power, it began to laugh wildly as ambitious and cruel thoughts circulated in its head. I, a monster of the goblin race, will crack. The creature that was now revealed to be a goblin and a monster was now missing its head. Dumb. An enormous 3 meters tall monster that was also humanoid but pink-skinned with a literal pig head and giant fangs appeared behind the deteriorating corpse of the goblin. It too was able to absorb the resulting killing essence from the goblin when it was reduced to ash. The killing intent aura that was exclusive to the monster species burst out of its body, revealing the strength of a stage 8 beginner monster. Looking at its appearance, wasn't this an orc? Meh. The orc was obviously disappointed in its gains. A stage 6 beginner monster probably wasn't much to him. Suddenly, its head snapped up, the picture of alertness and fear on its face. Without hesitation, it dashed into the bushes, fully intent on deserting this place. Oh-ee-I. Half a minute later, the sound of a pig screaming rang out before it was cut off. A red light filled with killing intent appeared in the direction the orc had run off. Clearly, it had been killed by another monster, and by the look of things it was a stage 1 intermediate monster. Monsters were another type of species altogether different from the beasts and enlightened races. Killing was the only way they gained strength, and killing was the only way they survived. Numerous scenes like this appeared throughout the entire continent, filled with monsters and the even more terrifying blood fiends. Welcome to the southern continent, where there's only one rule. Kill or be killed. 15 comments, 0 vote. Divine Demon Physique. Southern continent, at the very center of the central forest. Sitting on top a large boulder was a creature that looked like a 4-armed, gray-skinned ogre. It was 3 meters tall, extremely muscular, and had 2 tusks reaching out from its mouth. It also had long black hair, pointed ears, and abyssal black eyes. Last but not least were the jagged black horns on the sides of his head. This was Asura, chief of the savage earth and ogre tribe, and a rank 9 intermediate monster. A strength that far surpassed both the queen of the elves and the queen of the high humans. The savage earth and ogre tribe was a clan of ogres that had mutated when the magical outburst had arrived. They used to be like every other ogre, with the regular characteristics of muscular, 2 meters tall, green skin, pointed ears, and sharp tusks. But the savage earth and ogre tribe was clearly different, with their height that averaged 2.5 meters tall, their gray skin, and their perfect affinity with the earth element. Given the fact that Asura has a name, it was obvious that he was either someone Eridel had tampered with or someone Eridel had acknowledged before his seclusion. Actually, his story was quite interesting. The truth was that this tribe was actually quite special, considering the fact that they had 3 people that Eridel had blessed in here. Asura, Babunda, and their chief, Chrysos. Eridel had constructed a mutated Earth-grade physique that was tailored for monsters and bestowed it to them and a few others. A physique is the genetic makeup of the physical body, but when people speak of the term physique, in a world of cultivation, they are normally talking about a special body that was bestowed by fate and sometimes came with powers. Physiques could be split into 5 grades: mortal, earth, heaven, ageless, and void. Mortal grade was what everyone else currently had, and it could also be considered nothing, but people from high worlds would call it talentless, while people from low worlds would call it trash. As for the people above, they would look at you with pity, as if you were a cripple that lacked all your limbs. They had absolutely 0 innate talent. But don't let the term innate talent confuse you. When it came to physiques, innate talent was something like a guarantee. For example, someone with an Earth-grade physique was guaranteed to make it to the 4th realm of cultivation with no bottlenecks, and as long as you didn't suffer extensive damage, then you would make it. There would never be a need to worry about stabilizing your cultivation because it was permanently stable before the 4th realm. After that would be your own hard work. On top of that, if you somehow decided that you wanted to enter cultivation when you were already an old man, as long as you didn't die, you would still make it to the 4th realm eventually. Unlike other old men who were barred from cultivation completely. Heaven grade guaranteed the 7th realm. Ageless grade guaranteed the 9th realm. Void grade guaranteed the. So no, having 0, innate talent, didn't mean you wouldn't make it to the top, it just meant that you would have to work many times harder than people who had innate talent, on top of having to face bottlenecks. As for Asura and the others, they had mutated Earth grade physiques. And don't you dare let the term, mutated, fly over your head. A mutated physique was one that could upgrade to the next level if you met the requirements. This was something extremely rare to see but even harder to accomplish. Most people didn't even know if they had mutated physiques, and even if they did, how could they know the requirements? Was their own body supposed to instruct them? As a result, unless you had someone akin to a seer, you would need extreme luck to find and consume the needed ingredients. That being said, a system, aka the best guide in existence, would soon bless this world's residents. Unless they were retarded, they would never be lost. Sometimes a physique comes with extra powers, traits or perks. For example, the physique that Asura and a few other monsters had named the Divine Demon Physique. This physique granted them the following. 1. Divine IQ. Above mortal intelligence from birth. 2. Divine Monster. Purifying killing essence when you absorb it. 3. Divine Presence. Everyone facing you would feel like you were an existence that came from above. Monsters would especially revere you, and enemies will instinctively fear you, causing them to be unable to fight against you with their full power. 4. Divine Ruler. All those that follow you will be influenced by your thoughts and decisions. If you want to be a good ruler, you will have good subordinates. If you want to be an evil ruler, you will have evil subordinates. 5. Divine Demon. The stronger you are, the more attractive you become. You obtain 2 curved horns on the sides of your head that are extremely attractive to monsters of the opposite gender and intimidating to those of the same gender. The horns will always be on the side of your head and will always curl upwards, but the design of those horns will match your personality. As a result, if you experience any grand changes in personality, so will your horns. You will also obtain personalized killing essence. No longer will your killing essence and killing intent be red in color like other monsters, unless red is your personal favorite color. 6. Divine Damnation. Shoot a condensed beam of pure killing essence. 7. Free from fate. As you can see, the Divine Demon Physique only had 1 attack ability but had many perks traits. Physique powers are generally balanced out like this, but it should also be mentioned the Divine Demon Physique was extremely powerful for its Earth grade. It is definitely amongst the best of its kind. Asura, Babunda and Chrysos all had this physique. But as Eridel willed it, only one was meant to remain. 9 comments 0 vote. Demon King Armaments. Before this tribe had experienced the magical outburst, the tribe was led by the ogre named Chrysos. Chrysos was a charismatic and intelligent ogre that led his clan to reign supreme in the Central Forest, and even the indomitable Asura and ferocious Babunda were fiercely loyal to him. The other tribes could only fend off this ogre tribe if they teamed up with each other, because their power alone was insufficient, and without forming alliances they would be decimated. The reason for the tribal leader's strength was not only because of special physique, but all because of the unique gift that Eridel had given him. In fact, every monster that was bestowed the Divine Demon Physique was also gifted with a unique item which would later on become to be known as a Demon King's Armament. Chrysos was gifted with a stone mountain. Indeed, it was a stone mountain, but the size, weight and position could be freely adjusted by the user depending on their cultivation level. On top of that, the stone mountain emitted endless earth-killing essence that was beneficial to all monsters with earth affinity. This armament was called the Heavenly Demon Mountain. With the power of this armament, Chrysos along with the talented Asura and Babunda were able to mutate their killing essence into earth-killing essence. This was the same as someone forming their mana from an element, for example, the High Human Queen's light elemental mana. A mutated killing essence would still be red in color, but it would have an extremely different feeling from the rest. Killing intent normally feels like feeling like someone was going to just kill you, but earth killing intent felt like someone wanted to crush you into pieces. On top of that, there was an added gravity effect that prevented you from using full power. Moreover, when using earth killing essence in attacks like what those goblins did, each attack would be especially heavy. You could also circulate around your body to have a mountain-like defense. A mutated killing essence was 5x stronger than the elemental mana's counterpart, but just as hard to obtain. Consequently, the other ogres in the clan weren't talented enough to absorb the mutated killing essence and could only be like everyone else. Or that should have been the case. However, the magical outburst came around, and just like with the barbarian chief, an unknown criteria was met and Chrysos evolved into a high ogre with perfect earth affinity. He reached 2.7 meters tall, gained gray skin akin to the heavenly demon mountain, horns that looked like they were carved from a rock, and silver eyes. But Chrysos was not the only one to evolve. As Chrysos' loyal followers, his entire tribe including Asura and Babunda evolved, becoming the savage earth and ogre tribe of today, with all members wielding the earth-killing essence. This was definitely something terrifying, and even other worlders would think 3 times before fighting this tribe that they had seen nothing alike before. After all, monsters were something that only existed in this world. They were already horrifying, and for some mutated existences like the savage earth and ogre tribe to exist as well. Wasn't Eridel cheating too much? But that was not all. If Chrysos could meet the requirements to evolve, how can Asura and Babunda fail to do so? Let's rewind a bit. A greatsword, a halberd, a battle axe, a warhammer. These are 4 different red-colored weapons that radiated killing essence were placed in front of Asura. The first ever weapons in the world, and Asura was given the right to pick one. And not only that, these weapons were made from a special metal that was almost impossible to create and could never be formed naturally. It was killing metal. Killing metal was similar to magic metal in that it could absorb killing essence to cultivate itself. When this metal was used to kill, it would absorb some of the killing essence to empower itself, meaning that this was a weapon that could grow with the user. Obviously, the best users were monsters, but it wasn't impossible for others to use it. But for 4 of such weapons to be placed in front of one person, even immortals would become envious. Eridel gifted Asura 4 weapons because he knew that these weapons were too heavy to be dual-wielded, so you could only choose one and discard the rest. Giving them to someone else wasn't feasible either, as it would be like someone other than Thor trying to pick up Mjolnir, so the goal was that Asura chose one of the 4 weapons that he was most compatible with, and when he accomplished that, he would gain a permanent connection with it. It would no longer be too heavy for him, and he would gain martial art techniques specific to that weapon. The rest of the weapons would be destroyed. Unfortunately, Asura flipped the script. Eridel was too used to dealing with the primitive minds of the residents of his world and forgot that as a monster with the divine demon physique, Asura's intelligence was definitely not low. Psych. Who was Eridel? He was a 2,000-year-old world that had an unknown soul level. He was definitely up there with the top 10 smartest existences in the universe. How could something that he gave the ogre escape his calculations? That being the case, even though he knew that he had left a loophole, Eridel wanted to leave it up to fate. If Asura could grab this opportunity, then so be it. Asura studied each weapon carefully. He knew they were very powerful, and if he could grasp the power of just one of them, then his strength would be below the chiefs and above the rest. Even Babunda shouldn't be able to match him. Asura picked up the sword and examined it closer. As he did so, he could feel a familiar prompt that seemed to want to form a contract with him. Asura exerted all his power into both hands to swing with an overhead strike. Craack. The ground exploded as a 2 meters long fissure was created when the sword connected with the ground. If Eridel was here to watch this, his core would probably crack from anger. After practicing with the sword for a few minutes, he let it drop heavily to the ground before collapsing himself with sweat drenching his body. Whew! Asura looked at the surroundings that were even more destroyed than before and couldn't help but marvel at his power, even though the weapons were currently in a sealed state. He didn't know he was courting deletion. 20 comments, 0 vote. Asura quite liked the sword because of how versatile and easy it was to use. Out of all the weapons he currently had, this was the one that appealed to him the most, and if he had to choose, he would definitely go with the sword. But he didn't want to choose. He had spent quite a lot of time with each weapon by now, and each of them had their own uses that he couldn't think of going without anymore. The destructive lethality of the battle axe, the speed and dexterity of the sword, the long reach and power of the halberd, and last but not least the unblockable strength of the warhammer that could also double as a shield. Asura looked at all 4 weapons before sighing. "What should I do?" is what could be interpreted from his thoughts. Asura dragged the sword to the rest of the weapons before picking up the halberd. It was customary for him to practice with each weapon every day. Although the weapons were too heavy to take into battle, they at least served to train his muscles. He could feel his body becoming stronger each day, and it had nothing to do with his daily killings. Gaining power was his primary focus, and if there was any way to increase it, then he wouldn't hesitate. This world was too chaotic, and everywhere you looked people died. So if he didn't want to end up as someone else's nourishment, he needed to obtain more power. A power that would allow him to be invincible, a power that would allow him to control his fate and break out of the cycle of endless killing, a power that would allow him to set order to this ravaged world. Yes, that was his purpose. Asura's eyes glowed with passion as he began to think of what he should do with his power that was only matched by Chrysos and Babunda. He knew the three of them were different. Ever since he first came to be, he knew there was something seriously wrong with the others, including his own tribe members. They always killed and killed and killed, and there was never any reason for it. Even if it was exhilarating to gain strength, must they kill so excessively? Why should they so mindlessly take the lives of others? Asura didn't have any knowledge about good and evil, but his heart still skipped a beat when he thought of how those that had been ashed were never seen again. Was that really it for them? Did a mere claw in their heart or slice to the neck really forever banish them from seeing the next day? Wasn't that too harsh? What if that happened to him or his brothers one day? Monarch's note. Ashed is the term used when someone is killed by a monster. Most importantly, why was he not like the others? Why did the light of insanity that he saw in so many others not appear on him or Chrysos and Babunda? Why did he hesitate when the life of his enemies was in his grasp and he only needed to take one more step? Asura shook his head as doubts of the past tried to resurrect themselves. He knew his purpose now. Asura hefted the halberd high above his head before swinging back down with ferocious might. Boom! Looking at the new crater that joined the ones that decorated his surroundings, Asura smiled with content as shockwaves blew his hair and debris rained around him. Bringing order to this accursed world, that is my purpose. A couple months had passed and Asura had made tremendous progress. Thanks to his daily vigorous training, he was now able to dual-wield two of his weapons as long as the warhammer wasn't included. He was also now able to fight effectively with a weapon in battle as long as he only used one. This caused Chrysos and Babunda, who were always supporting, to congratulate him. They knew of his plight and were happy to see him return to the battlefield. It always confused them when they saw how Asura's armaments were inferior to theirs even though he had more. Even Babunda, with his pair of green glowing cuffs and dangling chains that didn't connect to each other, was stronger than Asura. Babunda's cuffs were called the shackles of the Juggernaut, and they augmented his body to make it tremendously powerful, especially his arms. If his arms or the chains themselves hit you, you were most likely going to die. On top of that, his vitality was also enhanced to terrifying levels that made the ogre almost undying. The reason the cuffs were green instead of red despite it being made of the same killing metal was because they had made a connection with Babunda and they took on the color of his killing essence, which was green. Maybe the more weapons you had the weaker they were. This was the only theory that Chrysos and Babunda could come up with. Who knows? Time continued to flow as Asura continued to grow stronger each day, multiple times faster than before now that he returned to the battlefield and could now cultivate more killing essence. Soon, he was able to dual-wield in battle even when he used the warhammer. His only lament was that he didn't have more arms to wield his other weapons. He was still very much unwilling to discard any of his weapons. Asura thought of Babunda's near-death experience in his fight against someone who was shockingly just like them. He knew that even if he chose one of his weapons and unlocked its full power, it still wasn't enough. He needed to find a way to unlock the power of all of them. So Asura continued to ferociously train with single-minded focus. At this point he had not slept normally for months. Now, swinging his weapons till he fainted each night was his night-night routine. 6 comments 0 vote. Savage Earth and Ogre Tribe vs Wraith Clan. Eventually the magical outburst arrived, changing things within the Ogre clan forever. Asura had achieved the woefully rare double evolution, experiencing his own evolution whilst obtaining the blessings of Chrysaor's evolution. When he evolved, his growing desire to wield all the armaments had actually manifested by giving him an extra pair of arms that enabled him to wield 2 more weapons. On top of that, he obtained a monstrous muscular strength that enabled him to wield each weapon with ease, making him an unblockable calamity to all of his enemies. But that was without the connection with any of his weapons. The day Asura made his connections with his weapons, the whole continent felt it. Asura was in a jubilant mood as he swung all 4 of his weapons through the bodies of his enemies with little resistance. The bodies of wraiths would either be split in half before dissipating into ash, or they would directly explode when they made contact with his warhammer. Just 7 days ago the whole world had experienced a great change that he couldn't comprehend. Even now his heart still palpitated when he thought of the series of events before his evolution. He really thought all life would end that day. But look at him now. Shik, boom, Asura's axe crashed through 3 wraiths and the boulder behind them. Asura raised his head to the sky and roared as if he was an abomination from the abyss, causing both ogres and wraith alike to flee from fear. Soon, there was a 20 meters radius around him that lacked all life apart from plants. Monarch's note. The abyss actually exists, more on that later. Closing curly bracket. Anyone could hear the unparalleled pride and fury in that voice. Whether they saw the origin of this voice or not, they knew that this was not and would never be a normal person, this was a monster to the monsters. The battlefield even quieted for a few seconds as everyone looked at him with various emotions. The Wraith King looked at him with displeasure, with something else hidden deeper, before cutting off the heads of 2 ogres with an ominous-looking scythe. Babunda's 2 heads looked at him with respect and pride before leaping into a crowd of wraiths with his 4 meters tall body. Chrysos looked at him with a strange emotion on his face before it quickly faded to indifference. He waved his hand, causing the flying mountain-shaped boulder in the sky to come crashing down on 3 unsuspecting wraiths. The rest of the ogres had mixing looks of fear and reverence. Whilst the wraiths, well, there were no emotions to be seen on a faceless entity, but the smoke-like substance that made up their bodies began to flicker erratically in an agitated motion. Wraiths were monsters that were, well, wraiths. They looked like grim reapers, a cloak made from a red smoke-like substance, with the only other color being the black mist where the heads should have been. Each one had a solid red lantern that contained a skull in their left hand. As they resumed the battle, red mist-like skulls were shot out of the lanterns like fireworks. This was a wraith's main way of attacking, and as they flew, the sound of a flying missile was heard as the mouths repeatedly bit the air. When they connected with a target, they exploded with a loud bang. Really and truly, they weren't unlike fireworks. As for the Wraith King, Asura looked at him a little warily. Even with his adrenaline rush, he still knew to pay close attention to this being at all times. Wraiths were typically around 1.5 meters tall, but the Wraith King was a whole 2 meters tall. Instead of being red like the others, he was a dark gray. Only the black mist where a head should be was the same. Even the lantern in his hand was different, being a little bigger than the others and black in color. Most eye-catching was the sinister onyx black scythe wrapped in dark bandages that the Wraith King carried in his right hand, and the ghost-like horns on each side of its head. Asura could tell that the scythe wasn't much different from the weapons that he owned and the shackles that Babunda wielded. It was 2.5 meters tall, with the serrated and razor-sharp blade being 1.2 meters long. Such a sight would cause anyone's heart to skip beats, but that wasn't the cause of Asura's concern. As Asura watched, the wraith would disappear in a puff of black smoke before reappearing in a different location. He would then swing the terrifying scythe with both hands or lift up the lantern in his left hand to shoot out a multitude of black skulls. He had the ability to summon and unsummon the lantern. Each time he appeared, death would follow. He was a very strong and very terrifying individual. He was the one that nearly killed Babunda after all. 2 weeks ago, the savage earthen ogre tribe, but just a powerful ogre tribe back then, had encountered the Wraith clan. They didn't have the lanterns back then, nor were they even wraiths. They were phantoms, ghost-like figures with terrifying faces. Naturally, like any meeting between different monster factions, it was an instant war. And normally the savage earthen ogre tribe would have won, but not this time. In this battle, they met a phantom king that was black in color with 2 horns on its head that curled to the sky and a terrifying scythe. All monsters with the divine demon physique were smart and quick-witted, hence the 4 beings could easily recognize each other for what they were. But Asura didn't care too much. Although they were intelligent, the idea of communication barely existed in the same race, talk less of talking with other monsters, so the immediate thought was something along the line of, "There are 3 of us and 1 on the other side. There is no way we could lose. Ha."